We were talking there about the basic standard operating principle now is that everyone has to get used to being poorer and diminished. And there's something going on a bit in the way these inflation statistics are being presented to us as purely cyclical things, Jamie.
Yeah, good evening, Mark. I think one of the things I think has come out over the last kind of week or so is the Bank of England's chief economist over in America, I think on a podcast, saying that people got to live with being poorer. And when you start looking in terms of, oh, what does he mean by this? What he's basically saying there, Mark, is you can't ask for bigger pay rises to catch up with the inflation, because he's right in some instances there, Mark, because if you actually say inflation's run at 10%, and then wages go up 10%, then the costs to business goes up. So prices go up again. So you start getting to kind of wage price spiral. But one thing these Bank of England economists didn't talk about, which is what we touched, I think, towards the back end of last show, Mark, was the fact that during lockdowns, printing all of this money, and that started fueling all the inflation that we've seen across the kind of the Western world. And moving King, I think I mentioned last week, former governor of the Bank of England, saying that all central banks made the same mistake. Now, you can't omit a major factor in what started the big inflation thing, which is starting to explain why kind of people are poorer. And the Bank of England have reacted, Mark, by putting up interest rates to try and fuel inflation, where in recent kind of the last, say, 6 to 12 months, it's been driven mainly by kind of food prices and energy prices. And remember, if energy prices go up, pretty much everything goes up, because it's all linked to energy as well, because you have to make things. And they put interest rates up as if that's going to start reducing the demand for food and energy. Well, it doesn't. We know quite clearly when you look at the data, Mark, that if inflation is being driven by those things, interest rate is not going to solve it.
Well, what are they trying to do here? I mean, it's a basic self-protection of the establishment, because they walled everybody up in their bedsits and then started printing money. So that's nothing to do with natural, 3-decade cycles or anything. That's the conscious government policy in London and Washington and Ottawa and Canberra and all across Europe.
Yeah, and what Moving King said was that central banks all, and this is worded, all made the same mistake. Now, some people on social media comment on that, saying, well, was it a mistake or was it all kind of planned? It just, you think now the people that you put in charge of your central banks, you would think that they are well educated, they know what they're doing, and for all of them to go in step change and all do the same kind of mistake at the same time, does start questioning what the hell was going on there, Mark. Because as you say, if you start printing money when people didn't need all this money when they were in lockdown, you couldn't do much. You couldn't go and do things. You had lots of money kind of going on. Inflation's kind of being fueled off the back of it. Kicked it all off. Then we saw this big explosion in the energy prices. We had the oil prices going up as well. And then, look at the UK solution to some of the the recent woes over the last 18 months, Mark, is the highest tax burden as well. So you've got prices going up, taxes going up. People can't afford to kind of live. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. And, something does need to change on that.
Yeah, this is the highest in the UK. It's the highest tax burden since the end of the Second World War, when basically the government was trying to pay off the costs of an almighty global conflagration. Here they're basically just trying to get out from the hole they dug for themselves.
Well, yeah, and what happened, you think of democracy, Mark. So we had Liz Truss elected by the Conservative kind of members. She came in, she had this budget with Kwasi Kwarteng. I think we've spoken in the past about the fact that, these are unfunded tax cuts. And some of the tax cuts is much less than kind of some of the basic spending that's going on, some of the migrants that are coming over across the UK. Yeah. And people are she got kind of thrown out because the IMF are questioning some of the unfunded tax cuts. And inflation in the UK, Mark, is still around about 10%. Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak have been promising to halve inflation. I've been kind of calling out the fact that I think when we get to next month's inflation figures, Mark, because remember what inflation is, just for people kind of watching, it's basically the annual change in prices. So when you look at the March figures, there's kind of taking a basket of goods. So there's similar amount of goods in the economy. You can't compare those prices to a year earlier. When we get to April, Mark, you'll be comparing a kind of a basket of goods, which includes the energy prices. So inflation should come down next month because we're not going to see as much of an increase in the energy price in April 2023 as what we saw in April 2022. Yeah. So when Rishi Sunak's talking about we've got policies to halve inflation, they're talking absolute nonsense. Inflation will naturally come down, regardless of what Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak says. And to kick out Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, that was a major coup in terms of what happened there politically. It pretty much was, Mark, the Conservative Tory MPs wanted Sunak in the first place. There was all this kind of dress up. Let's get Truss got elected because the members wanted it, and then they kicked her out.
Yeah, that's very true. And what's interesting is we don't the way he was manoeuvred in after losing the leadership election is a good indication of what happens if the masses are perceived to step out of line. They will, if the masses get out of line and vote for, so it doesn't matter whether you're talking about Brexit or whatever, if they vote for something that these shadowy types, whatever you call it, the markets, the IMF, they don't like it, they'll find a way of reasserting themselves. The other big story we've talked about for a year now on this show with you, Jamie, is the excess deaths, which in England and Wales were running at 1,000 a week for most of the last year. Now, there's an interesting development in the, and I want you to explain this to us because it's, again, it touches on something we explored back in the summer. There's an interesting development in that the excess deaths among the elderly appear to have stabilized, but among the young and middle-aged, there's something slightly weird going on.
Yeah, so let me just kind of explain just more broadly for some of your newer kind of viewers who are picking up some of the platforms, so Mark, what excess deaths are. So what you're doing here, Mark, is you're looking at the number of deaths that you're seeing, say, across any nation. So we're talking England and Wales here in the United Kingdom. And then you can kind of compare them to what you would class as a baseline. So if you've got kind of two populations of pretty similar, you'd expect similar kind of number of deaths. So historically, what we've looked at is the number of deaths, say, in 1 year, and compare this, say, to the kind of the 5-year average in the previous few years. Now, one of the issues you do have when you're doing that at the moment is that we've got a large number of post-war baby boomers. I think I mentioned this to you in the past, who were born literally just after the Second World War. They would be hitting kind of what you would class as life expectancy, so large numbers of those dying at the moment. So when you look at the average number of deaths, so say the 5-year period before the pandemic and look at 2023, you would expect more deaths than what you would expect if you did kind of age adjust things. And at the moment, Mark, what we're seeing is that if you start looking at the total number of deaths across England and Wales, they're kind of running at around 192,000 in 2023 so far. And when you actually predict, what would you expect the number of deaths to be? They're about 191,000. So 192 versus 191, not much difference there. And that's in part because when you adjust for all the age and these post-war baby boomers, there's not much difference. But when you start breaking it down, I think we might have a chart, Mark, I sent through to the producers that looks at kind of the age breakdown of different people. Yeah, what you actually see, Mark, I think, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, let's put that graph up. Yep.
Yeah, so this one here is looking at the average age of death. I think, no, this isn't actually the chart we were talking about. I'll just explain this one. This is looking at the actual average age of death from COVID. And what you can see that this is still running at around 85 now. But what I was going to be talking about is the fact that if you look at the kind of the age breakdown in terms of excess deaths, we've seen, very few excess deaths in 2023 overall. Yeah, this is the one. So it's running at about 0.6%. That's the kind of the top bar in the top left-hand corner there. And then what the table does there, Mark, is kind of says how many deaths have we seen? How many deaths would we expect? And what were the deaths over that average of kind of the period 2015 to 2019? And I suppose what's still alarming, and we saw this starting around week 19 of 2022, we can see at the bottom there, if you look at the ages 0 to 44, we're seeing 12.5% deaths above average. Now, we're not talking like hundreds of thousands of people here, because remember, fewer people die at these younger age groups. But it's still quite striking, Mark, that we saw this kind of phenomenon happening around week 19 all the way through 2022. We're still seeing it in 2023 when overall excess deaths are coming down. People are dying in that 0 to 44 age group, Mark, predominantly around people aged 30 to 44.
Well, it's not normal to die when you're 30. You know, we put up graphs from whatever it's called, the American Association of Actuaries, which showed the same thing, this bulge of excess deaths of people in late youth and early middle age. That's not a time, it's not a normal thing for somebody to die at 32 or 37 or 41. Why is nobody interested? And we've seen similar charts from Europe, similar charts in Australia. Why is no one interested in the subject?
Well, I think we've spoken many times on this, Mark. I wrote a blog in February asking why is the government so hesitant to kind of investigate these excess deaths. This came off the back of a parliamentary question. I think it was in the House of Lords. And then I think a similar question was asked a week later to one of the kind of contributors on behalf of the government there. And the answer was that people are looking at this in government. But I wrote this back in February now, 1st of May, Mark, coming up. We're into starting to May now. And we, this is just nonsense, the fact that we've had no answers. Now, if you actually look at this, say, 30 to 44-year-old age group I just talked about, when you actually look at overall, Mark, you're talking about 4,000 deaths this year among people aged 30 to kind of 44 overall. Because remember, people generally die a lot less at the younger age groups.
Yeah.
So for me, why can't the government just get all of these 4,000 death certificates, get these 4,000 NHS records, let's get all of the information. Let's look at if there's a fact to do with NHS delays, look at their previous COVID status, have they had the infections, how many vaccinations have gone out. Let's look at the complete pathway through the old health system, because unless somebody's literally just dropped dead outside and never been to the NHS, what are these causes of what's driving it? Well, we do know when we look at some other data, Mark, that heart issues are still coming up as one of the big factors. And something we talked about, I think, back end, the middle of last year, I think, is that if I take the March ONS figures, we're still seeing higher number of deaths for what you would class as what is called as symptoms, signs, and ill-defined conditions, which I think we discussed as cause unknown.
Yeah.
Similar again in March. I think the ONS has said this might be linked to old age as well. Well, I'm surprised if they're going to be saying this is all linked to old age. We need a proper root and branch inquiry into this, Mark. There's 4,000 deaths, 30 to 44-year-olds. Let's look at them all. Somebody in government, get the death certificates, get the data, get the NHS records, and let's really understand, why there's so many more excess deaths for this age group than what you would expect.
No, and as you say, you mentioned this, what I forget what you said was the ONS term, but which in other jurisdictions is called cause unknown. And when this first happened in Alberta in Canada, it's not normal for a first world jurisdiction for its leading cause of death to be cause unknown. That in itself is a reason to try and figure out what the hell is going on here. And as you say, it's incredibly easy. Get all the death certificates in that age group, and you can then look through, the underlying medical conditions and all the rest. But what I want, just as a final point here, Jamie, just let us in on that, because I've had quite a lot of mail about this. What people are worried about is that when you say we have excess mortality, it's excess mortality compared to a 5-year rolling average. So at a certain point, all the excess mortality we've reported on in the last year gets rolled into that 5-year rolling average and in a sense gets normalized. Is that the danger here, that we'll accept a 13% increase in deaths of the young and middle-aged as a normal feature of life?
Well, that depends on how people would want to kind of cut the data. So when I talk to you today, Mark, now about the excess deaths, and I'm talking about these younger people, I've looked at 2015 to 2019. I've looked at how many deaths did we see? What was the population numbers? Created a death rate, and then you can look at what's the current population profile and work out how many deaths you would expect. Now, over time, you need to start updating that, because what we've seen over the last, say, 50 years is improvement in mortality. I think what the data is showing across the world is that, especially through the pandemic, that improvement has been curtailed. It's gone kind of the other way, and life expectancy has been impacted by that. And what the ONS have done, I think they've taken out some of the pandemic years. When they report their numbers, they do it slightly different to what I would do. I'm not really sure why they do it the way they do, but you are right. If you start rolling those in and you are looking at kind of just raw numbers that could be an issue. So I think, people can follow me on Twitter. I think you highlight that. I kind of adjust for all of that factor, because you do need to take out the fact that when you get this abnormal effect within society, which is a pandemic, you need to strip that out and then look at how is kind of mortality going on at the moment versus what you would have expected had there been no pandemic.
Well, I'm glad you factor in some of these things, Jamie, because the idea that we're in effect statistically normalizing the sudden deaths of 33-year-olds would be in itself deeply disturbing. Thank you very much, Jamie. As he said, you can check him out on Twitter at StatsJamie, or you can go to his website, statsjamie.co.uk.